Hello, I'm Richard Matthew, and for a few years I was a guide for tours of the Guildhall. The tours ceased some 2 or 3 years ago, so in this talk I'll be taking you on a virtual tour to give you some idea of the history of this fascinating building. And my talk will concentrate on the physical aspects of the building. What took place within it will be material for another talk, or indeed several. It's a building which, although it's right in the centre of Norwich, has been rather taken for granted by Norwich people, I feel. And I hope my talk will begin to convince you of the central importance of this building in the whole life of the city, from the 15th century up to very recently, and for the need for it to be accessible by the public. I hope you enjoy the talk. A tour of Norwich Guildhall. This shot, uncluttered by traffic or people, reminds one of what an impressive building it is. And here we can see one reason why the building may be taken for granted. Since 1938, it has been dwarfed by its huge neighbour, the new City Hall. On the right, you can see the huge tower looming over the Guildhall, and on the left, the whole building of City Hall. Some would say rather out of scale with its surroundings. But to begin at the beginning, it was the granting of a new charter by Henry IV in 1404 which triggered the building of the Guildhall. And here's an extract from it: that the city and all the land within the city shall be and are hereby separated from the county of Norfolk. Interesting. And are hereby made a county of and by themselves, which shall be forever called the county of the city of Norwich. So the charter gave Norwich a considerable degree of self-government, the right to elect its own mayor and 2 sheriffs, and to have a city council and a common assembly of 60 people, one of a very few such cities in England. It could also elect 24 aldermen, 6 from each of the 4 great wards. So a new building was needed, worthy of its new status, and to house the various courts and administrative staff. Up to this point, the city only had a relatively small toll house in the market for the collection of taxes, for small meetings, etc. In this map of 15th century Norwich, we can see that the new Guildhall was built on the site of the toll house, here. And it incorporated the toll house undercroft to be used as a dungeon. So it was in the heart of the Norman city, under the castle here and near the cathedral here. Opposite St Peter Mancroft Church here, and in the ward of Mancroft, this ward here, where many of the wealthy merchants and the elite of Norwich lived. The building of the Guildhall. It was a massive project, one of the most expensive in the city's history so far, with the exception of the castle, cathedral and the friaries, and it was and remained for centuries the largest civic hall outside London. It is still the largest surviving medieval Guildhall. Building began in 1407 and wasn't completely finished until 1453, when the mayor's courtroom was glazed. It was built of flint, of which there were good local sources, even within the city itself. It was paid for largely from a tax levied on all the inhabitants, and some material was supplied by the wealthy, such as William Appleyard, who supplied a large tree trunk and became the first mayor. Some parishioners and foreigners, i.e. non-Norwich-born men, were pressed to work on the building from 5 AM to 8 PM, and around £500 was spent on lead for the roof, nearly half the total cost. Luckily, many of the Chamberlain or Treasurer's accounts have survived, and we can see here some extracts from 1413. The master mason, in effect the architect, was John Moore, and he was paid 6pence a day, while labourers were paid 4pence a day. And here we can see John Moore being paid for his hire for 3 days He's also a carpenter, obviously, to make the Penny door, the Penny being the penitentiary, which I think refers to the dungeon, which we'll see later. He's also paid for transporting 1 cartload of lead from the common stave in King Street, which was owned by the city. And here we can see a carter, Cantel the carter, play for transporting 1 large tree donated to the Guildhall by William Appleyard. Other items in the accounts, and there are pages of them, included payments for lime, nails, rope, stone, timber, locks, hinges, tars, etc. And if you want, you can. There is a website with a very good transcription of all these Chamberlain accounts for the building of the Guildhall. Well, what did the Guildhall contain? Well, it contained the dungeon, which, as I said, utilised the existing 14th century toll house Undercroft, a free prison where the prisoners were unchained, that's what I meant by free, a chapel for the prisoners, the mayor's court or council chamber where the mayor met with the 24 aldermen, the sheriff's court, which was also used as the assembly chamber for the common assembly of 60 people, and there was a solar or upper room. Over the years, there have been many changes to the building, and first I'll take you on a quick tour of the outside to touch on some of those changes. And here in this view from the south, we can see the porch, the existing porch, which has been rebuilt a number of times over the years. What we see today is Victorian, and here was the Treasury Tower, which collapsed in 1511 and was not rebuilt. Almost none of the windows in the Guildhall are original. We can see here these Victorian Gothic windows, and note the Bassingham Gateway here, and here's a close-up of it. This Tudor doorway was moved here in 1857 to create a new entrance for judges and magistrates to the courtroom, above which we'll see later. It came from John Bassingham's house in London Street when it was demolished. He was a goldsmith, and we can see here the arms of the Goldsmiths Company on the right, with the arms of Henry VIII in the centre here, and the city arms on the left, yet another version of the city arms. And if we go now round the corner from the, here's the Bassingham Gateway, we go round here to the west side. There was originally another tower here on this corner to match the Treasury Tower here. This tower on this corner was demolished in the 18th century. These windows may be original, but they are more like the shape of the original windows as opposed to the Gothic ones we've just seen. Continuing round now to the north side here, and we come round this corner here, coming down Guildhall Hill, or I think it's Jail Hill. Continuing round the north side, here in the basement area in 1660, an entrance was made for a cloth hall in the basement area, although almost nothing is known about how it functioned or for how long. Presumably, it was a way of the city controlling the quality and sale of cloth, and no doubt imposing taxes on it, as they had done for several centuries previously. The basement area or later contained cells for prisoners to be held while awaiting trial right up to the 1980s, and we'll see some of these later. This entrance here, now the Crystal Shop, is believed to have been made for storage of the city fire engine. Some sources say as early as 1660, others give some time in the first half of the 19th century. But we know by 1846 there was a city fire service which was part of the Norwich police service. At the end of the 19th century, a new fire station was built in Pottergate. This shot is presumably between the wars, and to continue the fire engine theme, suggests the close connection between the fire service and the city administration, although, as I said, by then the fire station was in Pottergate and later moved to Bethel Street. We're now just looking at the east view in this sketch by Civic of 1828, where the bicycle racks, this is where the bicycle racks are now, outside Tesco on the edge of the marketplace. We can note the flushwork checkerboard pattern, either original or more probably added when the mayor's courtroom, which is behind this wall here, and we'll see this window from the inside towards the end of the tour. It was when the mayor's courtroom was rebuilt after the ceiling, this ceiling, interior ceiling here, collapsed also in 1511, and it's thought that this pattern also symbolized the role of the Guildhall as an exchequer. We can also see the earlier porch here with a loggia, which is presumably for the VIPs to look over the market and to be seen by the multitude. And then we see another view only 4 years later by Hodgson, the Guildhall looking very similar, and we can see how disorderly the market is, or was rather, compared with the one we know today. And here's a late 19th century photo showing the same kind of congestion in the market. And of course, this is before the new City Hall, 1938 City Hall, was built here. We'll now take a closer look at this flushwork, as you can see here. And over here we see 3 lots of coats of arms. And the St George's Guild here had its base in the Guildhall and was the most powerful religious guild in the city, being effectively merged with the City Council in 1452 and remaining so until the Reformation some 100 years later. The royal arms of Henry VIII, which were here, have decayed and disappeared, and on the right are yet another version of the city arms, somewhat decayed, due for, I think, for a bit of restoration and cleanup. Today we can see here on the top of this east end Mayor Woodcock's clock of 1851. He donated a clock on condition that the corporation remove the false ceiling in the council chamber, that's the mayor's courtroom, and laid open the new roof. It previously had lath and plaster ceiling, and he wanted this removed for some reason. I'm not sure that the clock entirely suits the medieval Guildhall, but it certainly remains as a prominent memorial of Mayor Woodcock. In 1861, the south porch was rebuilt and now housed the chief constable and some police in this section of the porch here, which is the present porch. And here, which I'll show you a close-up of in a minute, down the bottom, right to ground level, we can see where this was the original, where the original entrance to the undercroft of the toll house was, which was blocked up when the Guildhall was built, and a grille was inserted to provide a rather limited amount of light and air for the prisoners in what became the dungeon, which we'll go into later. And here's a close-up of the grille, and you can see how small it is. And we always imagine the good citizens of Norwich pushing spare food through that grille down to the unfortunate prisoners below. And above that, and a bit to the left, again on this east end of this Victorian porch, we see where the sign for the Norwich Chief Constable from 1861, when the porch was rebuilt. Another example here of the way everything in the civic aspect of Norwich revolved round the Guildhall. We've got the fire station, we've got the police, etc. And now we have the Lutyens War Memorial of 1927, which has now been relocated to opposite the new City Hall of 1938, cementing the takeover by the new City Hall, or fairly new. and a photo of the Lord Mayor's coach in 1938. Those were the days when the Lord Mayor had a coach and horses. This was the last year, of course, of the approximately 500 years of the Guildhall as the centre of civic life before the new City Hall was built. And here we can see in Needham's drawing of 1861, we can compare the porch just before the 1861 rebuild with it, how it looked after the rebuild. And notice here this justice figure, again emphasising the central role of the Guildhall in the justice system, another aspect of the importance of the Guildhall in the civic life of Norwich. We'll refer to that justice figure a little bit later when we're in one of the courtrooms. And here another landmark perhaps in the history of the Guildhall, 1939, we see the sandbags up as protection against air raids. And as many of you will know, of course, the major air raids came in the Norwich Blitz in April, I think it was, of 1942. So we'll now go through today's south entrance with this, again, another version of the city arms above it, quite a nice one actually. And down, firstly, we'll go down to the dungeon, the old Undercroft, and then into the cells area in the basement nearby. So here are the stairs, the original stairs from the semi-basement area to the dungeon, which was the Undercroft. It's possible that these stairs also continued upwards to the mezzanine floor to provide direct access for the prisoners from the dungeon to the chapel immediately above, now demolished, and we'll see the remains of that a bit later. And we're now inside the dungeon, the doors being closed, and could this be John Morrow's or John Moore's Pentney door mentioned in the Chamberlain's accounts? We don't know, but it certainly looks pretty old, and you would certainly know that there was no escape through here once you've been thrown in, and almost no natural light and very little air. And here is the dungeon that you would have been in. This is looking towards the east wall where we saw the grille, and the grille in fact is behind this pillar here on this east wall, somewhere just behind there, and you can just see the limited light coming in. You can see that the building, the Undercroft, resembles many of the Undercrofts in Norwich. For example, those of you who know Dragon Hall, this is a very similar kind of construction. Here we have two early examples of graffiti done by prisoners, as they are wont to do, as we'll see some more 20th century ones in a minute. This ship motif here is quite common as a symbol of life's voyage. The dungeon would have been used mostly for prisoners awaiting trial or execution, as imprisonment was not a common punishment for ordinary criminals until the 19th century. We only have time to mention two well-known people held in here. The first is Thomas Bilney, a Cambridge academic from Norfolk, and a Protestant martyr under Henry VIII, who was held here for a few days before being burned in Lollard's Pit in Norwich in 1531, only 2 years before Henry VIII's break with Rome. So he's a Protestant martyr, not a Catholic martyr. And this is from Foxe's Book of Martyrs, very famous Protestant book, first published in 1563. And it's thought to show Bilney testing his hand in the flame prior to being burnt. The second person to note who was kept in here is Robert Kett, who together with his brother William, after being brought from London after Kett's rebellion, was held here before being hanged from the castle battlements and left there as a warning to the citizens. His brother was hanged from the tower of the Abbey in Wymondham, where they came from. One other little interesting story about the dungeon here is that in 1940, the city felt that a German invasion was imminent, and they had the very valuable city regalia bricked up in one corner of the undercroft. And there is a story that only one person on the council staff knew where it was hidden, and the hope was that he wouldn't die or be killed by a bomb. We now go back up the stairs, where we're in a semi-basement area, and then down into the basement area where you saw, where I pointed out the entrance on the north side, which was made. And here there are some 20th century police cells, but we know, as one of them, we know that there was a prison in this area from the outset. And there must have been cells here from at least 1747, as this was when a new assize court was created in what was until recently the Britannia Cafe, as we'll see in a minute, and stairs led directly from the cells up into the dock of the court. The cells continued to be used by the police right up until 1983, when new courts were built near the cathedral. And here is a 1983 graffiti, K. Steele was here, and he expects 18 months. So he's obviously stealing himself. In this area originally was the felons' prisoners, where the prisoners were kept in chains. In 1597, they were moved to a new site nearby, and in 1660, the Cloth Hall, which I mentioned earlier, was in this area. To mention just one gruesome story, we must have one, this area is where the police buried some body parts, which in 1851 were found scattered around the city. In 1869, they were dug up and they're used to convict William Shoord of the murder of his wife, to which he had confessed in London and was brought back to Norwich, tried and was hanged. Also to be seen in this area is a very large rough beam. I can't show you a photo of it because it just doesn't lend itself to that. This rough beam is clearly made from one tree, and it's speculated that this is the great tree that Mayor Appleyard donated in 1411. It's nice to think that anyway. Now we'll go back to the ground floor and the entrance foyer, where we'll see on the first floor this rather nice mosaic, yet another version of the city arms, believed to have been made by Italian craftsmen in the late 19th or earliest 20th century. There were several waves of Italians who moved into Norwich, particularly a group at the end of the 19th century who lived mainly in the Burr Street area. It would be nice to know more about this. Maybe someone listening to this can tell us. If we go to the left of that foyer on the ground floor, we're in what today is or was recently, the Britannia Cafe, previously Cayley's Cafe. This area here was originally the free prison, where prisoners were left unchained, probably used for debtors who stayed there until their debts were paid. And in 1660, this space became a yarn hall at the same time as the Cloth Hall was made in the basement, presumably for similar purpose. In 1747, after the Shire Hall elsewhere in the city burnt down, it was converted to, and although Norwich, as we know, was a separate county from Norfolk, this space was converted to a court for the county assizes. And this is essentially what we can see in this left-hand pre-war photo. We can see the judge's chair there, with the arms of George II above, which dates it nicely, and mace stands on each side. And to the left and right, there's a public gallery overlooking the court. Later, this became the Court of Record, and from 1909, the Juvenile Court, and it continued to be used as a court until 1985. So you can see, and this will be emphasized when we go upstairs, how much the justice system was played a huge part in the life of the Guildhall, as well as its role as the meeting for the City Council, originally the Mayor's Court and then the City Council. We'll now go up the stairs to the mace, a few stairs to the mace room on the mezzanine floor, with its Georgian style panelling here, probably installed at the same time as the conversion of the downstairs courtroom in 1747. Little is known about the use of this room. It surely can't have been full of regalia. But the cupboards on the right do have very stout locks, and it is, we know that they held the city's regalia, which is some very valuable items. And here we can see Mayor Ethel Coleman in 1923, very famous Lady Mayor of Norwich, with the various mace bearers, sword bearers, and so on. If we go up a few steps, we come out of the mace room and go up a few steps, we come to the area where the chapel was, and these are the remaining timbers of the chapel, the few remaining timbers, and these little corbels here, rather nice, which was demolished in 1625. The chapel was dedicated to Saint Barbara, who was the patron saint of prisoners. Here she is, as depicted on a rood screen in a church. I've forgotten which one, someone may know. And she's shown there with holding her prison, because she was walled up in the prison, I believe, by her father. In 1724, this area was converted, and in a door to the left here, it was made into an office for the sheriff, and is now still used by the sheriff, as known as the sheriff's parlour. If we now go up the stairs to the second floor, we'll find a landing, the mayor's courtroom or council chamber, and the sheriff's courtroom or assembly chamber, or has been known at one point as the sword room, and recently a magistrate's court. And when we get onto the landing, we see this colonnade installed in the late 18th century, around the time of the county assizes being held here. This door over here is the flood room, called thus because it was used at the time of the 1912 floods for the payment of hardship grants. The colonnade was obviously designed to provide a grand entrance to the mayor's courtroom, which lies ahead through there, which we'll go into last. We can look at this elaborate carving above here and see the symbols of the mayoral and through the mayor, the royal authority. So we see the civic mace here, the sword. Only the mayor was allowed to have someone holding a sword processing through the city in front of him, and the winter cap of maintenance. I won't explain all that because it's a rather long story. And then if we go behind us to the right, as we were looking at the colonnade, we come into this courtroom here. And this is as fitted out in the late 19th or early 20th century, used for magistrates and quarter sessions up to 1985. But originally this space would have looked completely different and was used as the sheriff's courtroom. We don't know how it looked, or the common assembly chamber, where the Common Council of 60 members met. Later it became known, as I said, as the sword room, because in the roof here was stored a whole lot of weapons as for the militia. You can see here the judge's chair and the magistrate's bench here, when it was in use as a magistrate's court, the large dock here, the dock is here, and the witness stand here on the right, and desks for the court officials. Behind the chair here, there's a doorway, or one of these doorways, either of these doorways, led to stairs up from the Bassingham Gateway, which we saw on the south side. And here, up here is the justice figure, which I mentioned, which we originally saw over the south porch. At some point it got lost and then was rediscovered in an auction by somebody who bought it and donated it to the city and put her back here. She still has her sword, but she's lost her scales of justice somewhere along the way. We could just mention one of many, many cases that occurred in this court. That is of 1839, when little William Tuck, aged 8, was sentenced to transportation for stealing 2 glass bottles. My goodness. Right, so we go out of this courtroom and go through the colonnade, under the colonnade. We go to the last room on our tour, the mayor's courtroom, arguably the most important in the building, where so many things central to the city's administration occurred over the centuries. This is not exactly how it was built in the 15th century. This is as refitted after 1511, as I mentioned when we were looking at the East End, when the roof collapsed. And this is where the Court of Aldermen and the Mayor's Court met. So it wasn't just a court of justice, although the mayor was ex officio a JP, but a court where much of the city's administration was carried out. It sat weekly for appeals from lower courts and cases involving apprenticeships, cloth quality, ale houses, vagrants, births, deaths, trade regulations, and bylaws. It was also used for the Court of Requests and the Court of Pleas. Just a couple of examples of the sorts of cases which we know happened here, and there's many, we have records of many. Just one example, in 1578, Matthew Payman was sentenced to have his ears cut off for slandering the Queen's Majesty, and was later burned for heresy. Another example, Alice Crown, a widow, for stealing a remnant of cloth out of the shop of a shop, privately whipped, and I don't know why privately, and kept 6 months at hard labour in the Bridewell. And the City Council, in fact, the whole City Council met here until 1938, when the new City Hall was opened. It must have been very cramped, as presumably all the offices and courts were, given how much business was conducted in the Guildhall. And in fact, office space gradually expanded outside the Guildhall into a whole array of buildings on the west side of the marketplace, which were eventually demolished to make way for the new 1938 City Hall. To understand fully how central to the whole life of the city this court was, one needs to read the copious minutes of the proceedings. And strangely, only 2 volumes, as far as I know of these, have been published by the Norfolk Record Society, and those for the years 1630 to 1635. And unfortunately, there's no time to give you any more extracts today, fascinating as they are. Behind the mayor's chair here, we can see some fine linen fold panelling and other carvings with I think the city arms again here. And this is the arms of the grocers company. These are cloves, not bombs. Grocers and mercers comprised the majority of the aldermen and mayors in the 15th and 16th century. They pretty much had control of the city. We also see a dragon here, a Tudor dragon, a nod to the Tudor monarchy, no doubt, and a curious animal carving, rather nice, reminiscent of the sort of pew ends one finds in many Norfolk churches. If we go back to this shot here, pre-war shot of the courtroom, it shows us how much more decorated it was, particularly by these civic portraits here. And if anybody was anybody, once they became an alderman or mayor, they had their portrait painted. Many of these can be seen in St Andrew's Hall and Blackfriars Hall to this day. Here's just one example, John Norman, mayor of 1714, in his grand robes and his wig. Also here was, until the city council vacated, a sword, which had been donated by no less than Horatio Nelson, which it was given to him by a Spanish admiral who surrendered to him, and he immediately wrote to Norwich a note and presented them with the sword. Now, the east end here is the main east window, Here we are. And note the fine stained glass, but none of it in its original position, as much reglazing was done after the ceiling collapsed in 1511, and it's very much a hodgepodge of different periods from the 15th to the 19th centuries. Some of it is almost certainly original glass made in the Norwich workshop of John Whiten, who was also an alderman. The glass would warrant a separate talk by an expert, and to see more you can go to the Norfolk Stained Glass website, which is very good. I'll just very quickly, to finish off the tour, show you some of its riches. Each side of the main window is a smaller window with some very fine glass. We see here, for example, this angel blowing a bagpipe. Here it is in close up. This is pretty certainly John Whiten's work and was very likely originally in the chapel. In the central window are the arms of Elizabeth I, also a number of saints, and the arms of the Merchant Adventurers Company. And here we can see another angel with a wonderfully expressive face, very typical of Whiten's work. In the central window are the arms of Elizabeth. We've seen it. Here we've seen Elizabeth's arms. Here we see the arms of John Mann, with I think some more city arms here. And in the centre, he was obviously a mercer, I think, or rather here on the right. This is the Mercer's Maiden, who was the symbol of the London Mercers Company. Some Norwich Mercers were members of the London Mercers Company as well, one of the great guilds or companies in the city. And here we see the mace, and this is, I think, the cap of maintenance that we saw up in the on the landing. We'll conclude our tour with this, another fine example of the city arms, a fine example for a fine city. So thank you very much for coming on my tour, and I hope you enjoyed it.